If you find these slow wanderings through history enjoyable, a quiet like and a subscribe genuinely helps. And if you feel like it, you can drop a note in the comments telling me where in the world you happen to be listening from, because it's always a lovely thing to see how far these stories. Hey guys, tonight we settle in with something every one of us has in common, even if we do it very differently, and that is sleep. Or to be more exact, the surprisingly strange ways people in the Middle Ages drifted off at night, which turn out to be far odder than you might expect. Travel. With that said, let us ease gently into tonight's journey. Long before electricity, before glowing screens and bedtime routines and all our careful talk of sleep hygiene, the people of medieval Europe met the night with a rhythm that would thoroughly puzzle any modern devotee of melatonin gummies. They practiced what we now call segmented sleep, a natural rest divided into two distinct halves, split cleanly down the middle. The pattern was unhurried and simple. Once the sun went down, most folk retired early and sank into what was known as the first sleep. Then, some 4 hours later, they would rouse themselves on purpose and spend the following hour or two engaged in what we might fondly think of as medieval midnight busywork. None of this was regarded as insomnia. It was simply the way sleeping worked. That stretch of wakefulness between the two sleeps was considered useful, practical, and sometimes rather sociable. People filled it by praying, by reading scripture, by tending the fire, or by stepping out to look in on their animals, since little disturbed a good night's rest, quite like wondering whether the goat is still where you left it. And yes, this quiet interval was also held to be the ideal moment for intimacy. Physicians of the age, along with the marriage manuals of the day, observed that the body was rested and the mind was calm during this window, which one suspects was a gentle way of saying that everyone was finally too sleepy to bicker. So if you have ever felt rather noble for rising early to bring someone their morning coffee, take some comfort in knowing your ancestors had set that particular bar somewhere else entirely. After this interlude came the second sleep, which carried on until the first light of dawn. Everyone kept to this nightly rhythm, from monks in their cloisters to labourers in the fields, and even the writers of the time made passing mention of it. Chaucer, for one, refers to it quite casually, which means that even in medieval literature people were, in a manner of speaking, writing about not sleeping straight through the night. And here is the curious part. Modern research has suggested that this divided pattern may in fact be more natural to us than we assume, since a two-part sleep tends to align with how our internal clocks behave when artificial light is taken out of the picture. So should you ever find yourself wide awake at 2 in the morning, there may be less reason to fret than you think. You are, in a sense, simply keeping the old watch. It wasn't until the industrial age, with its factories and its gas lamps and its swelling anxiety about wasted hours, that people began to insist upon 8 unbroken hours of rest, as if sleep had become some sort of timed event to be won or lost. In the medieval world, waking in the dead of night was not a failure of any kind. It was simply the schedule, and everyone was on it, whether they were fond of it or not. Now, let us turn to beds, or rather to the medieval idea of what a bed might be. These days we fuss endlessly over thread counts and memory foam and cooling layers, debating whether a mattress feels sufficiently like a cloud. In medieval Europe, a bed was more often a heap of things that had once been alive, now pressed flat by years of use. The ordinary peasant slept on a straw mattress called a pallet, which was little more than straw or hay packed into a sack of coarse cloth, assuming one was fortunate enough to own a sack at all. If not, It was simply straw spread upon the floor, perhaps a little damp, perhaps already taken over by the household cat. These pallets were far from comfortable, yet they were a great deal better than the alternative, which was nothing. Straw was cheap, easy to come by, and rather good at holding off the cold. It was equally good, unfortunately, at sheltering insects, lice, and the occasional field mouse, which turned a night's sleep into a quiet exercise in not moving very much. If something itched, you learned to ignore it. If something bit, you shifted a little and hoped for better luck. A family with a bit more money, or perhaps just a back that demanded mercy, might raise the straw mattress onto a wooden frame, which did little to improve the actual sleeping, but did slightly lower the odds of waking with a beetle in one's ear. Linens were a rare treat, and most people simply slept in the same clothes they had worn all day. Night clothes were largely unheard of, and so was privacy. Whole families, children and parents, and perhaps a grandparent too, slept together in one space, sometimes upon the very same pile of straw, so that if you grew too warm, you could always roll gently into a cousin's elbow. The nobility naturally had proper beds, with grand wooden frames, feather mattresses, embroidered sheets, and canopies meant to keep out both the draughts and, with luck, the lice. Such beds were so prized that they were handed down in wills, and you might find yourself inheriting not land, but rather a curiously lumpy feather bed that had once belonged to some long-departed aunt. For most people, though, a bed was never truly about comfort. It was a place to keep from freezing, to stay clear of the chickens, and perhaps to dream of one day being wealthy enough to sleep on something that neither rustled nor squawked. When we say nightcap today, we tend to picture a small, comforting drink beside a warm fire. In the Middle Ages, however, a nightcap was not a beverage at all. It was a hat, a genuine and often rather absurd piece of cloth meant to keep one's head from going cold through the night. Insulation, you see, was never a strength of medieval building. Stone walls, draughty thatched roofs, and windows fashioned from thin animal horn or oiled parchment did very little against the chill. And as for central heating, well, that was usually called a dog. So, since a good deal of warmth escapes through the head, people took to wearing the humble nightcap. These caps came in every shape imaginable, though the most familiar version was long and tapered to a point, rather like something you might expect on a wizard who keeps a side trade in chimney sweeping. They were typically made of wool or linen or whatever spare scrap of warmth could be found. For men it was a simple practicality, while for women it sometimes served as a coif or head wrap as well, keeping both modesty and unruly hair tidily in place. But the nightcap carried social meaning too. In certain regions, married women were expected to keep their heads covered at all hours, even in sleep, and the cap itself might be dyed or embroidered to hint at a family's standing. In some towns it even became a quiet signal that one was off duty, so that opening your door in a nightcap was a polite way of letting a visitor know you were not dressed for conversation. The caps were often worn alongside nightshirts, which were really just long, loose tunics. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge without the moral reckoning. Sleepwear of the age was never elegant, but it was practical, frequently itchy, and now and then alarmingly close to the candle flame. These days, the idea of sleeping beside a stranger is mostly confined to red-eye flights, over-ambitious camping trips, or the occasional baffling mix-up at a rented room. In medieval Europe, though, it was entirely ordinary and not really a matter of choice. Imagine you are a travelling merchant or a pilgrim, or simply someone whose mule has given out partway to Norwich. You find an inn, itself a small piece of good fortune, and you ask for somewhere to sleep. What you are offered is not a room, nor a bed of your own, nor even a particularly clean patch of floor. What you are offered is a space in a bed that already has someone in it. Medieval inns ran far more like communal bunkhouses than anything we would call a hotel. No one expected privacy. If there was room in the bed, you were sharing it, very likely with complete strangers who might snore, mutter in their sleep, or carry a worrying number of boils. None of this counted as rude. It was simply an efficient use of what little there was. A single bed might hold 2, 3, even 4 travellers, depending on its size and on everyone's tolerance for company. In the larger cities, you might land in a hall lined with rows of beds and no personal space whatsoever, where snoring went unjudged and every inch of elbow room was fiercely defended. Sometimes men and women were kept apart, though not always. Some inns tried to sort their guests by trade, putting smiths with smiths and clergy with clergy, but more often it was simply first come, first sprawled. Travellers worried about theft often slept with their purse tied to their belt or tucked beneath their clothing, while others lay directly atop their bundles, turning their luggage into both pillow and alarm at once, since anyone shifting your bag generally meant you were about to wake up rather. And while this might sound like a misery to the modern lover of cleanliness, at the time it was a real improvement over sleeping out of doors among the wolves and the rain. Poorer. The wealthy, of course, were spared all of this. Nobles travelled with whole retinues and either camped in relative comfort or simply demanded a room of their own, which any innkeeper who valued his roof was wise to provide. In the medieval world, going to bed was never just a matter of pulling up a blanket and drifting off. It was something closer to a spiritual undertaking, a nightly wager in which the stakes were nothing less than your eternal soul. People did not merely sleep, they prepared, just a little, for the possibility of dying. This is why bedtime prayers were so beloved. In place of lavender mist or a soothing voice in your ear, medieval sleepers settled themselves with confessions, with psalms, and with quiet spiritual housekeeping, just in case the night carried them off somewhere between good night and dawn. The reasoning was plain enough. You could be taken at any moment by illness, by fire, by what people believed were demons, or simply by the considerable hazard of being over 30 in the year 1247. Better, then, to say your prayers, not for the comfort of it, but because the alternative was thought to be genuinely terrible. One familiar little verse ran, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take," which sounds sweet until you notice it is essentially a small child calmly acknowledging death as a plausible outcome of going to bed. Many grown adults kept an entire repertoire of such prayers, one for moments of guilt, one for nights when the devil seemed to be lurking somewhere in the rafters, one offered up against the plague, which sadly did not prove very effective. The truly devout, the monks and nuns and the more anxious among the nobility, closed their day with compline, the final service before sleep, after which came a vow of silence that was not especially difficult to keep, given that everyone was already exhausted and more than a little wary of the. Children, too, were encouraged to pray, partly for the good of their souls and partly to give them something to occupy themselves with, other than asking why the dog was in their bed again, and parents would remind them that angels were watching over them, which is a charming thought until you. Some prayed to particular saints known for watching over sleepers, a kind of holy guardian posted at the soul's door. Dark. Consider it as something rather closer to constant heavenly supervision. In short, prayer before sleep was less about peace of mind and more about a little last-minute tidying of one's spiritual affairs, a sort of medieval safeguard that one hoped would do its work, even without quite understanding how. In our own time, we tend to brush dreams aside as so much nonsense, the product of stress, or a late supper, or the brain quietly sorting its files in the dark. In the medieval world, dreams were treated with the utmost seriousness, the sort of seriousness that carried eternal consequences. A dream was not merely a dream. It might be a message from God, from a saint, from the devil himself, or from one's own guardian angel. Some dreams were taken as divine revelations, and others as the temptations of demons. But either way, one was meant to take careful notice, perhaps to write the dream down, perhaps to confess it, perhaps to fast for 3 days just to be on the safe side. Theologians, monks, and a fair number of self-appointed visionaries devoted a remarkable amount of time to untangling the meaning of dreams, and whole volumes were given over to decoding them. Dreams of fire were sometimes read as a glimpse of hell, while dreams of water might point either to cleansing or to drowning, and if you happened to dream of a man with a goat's head juggling fish, the sensible course of action was to summon a priest at once and perhaps consider relocating. To the medieval mind, what unfolded in a dream genuinely mattered, because the soul was understood to remain awake and busy even as the body rested. This meant that whatever you did while dreaming might expose buried sins or quiet failings of the spirit. So that faintly embarrassing dream in which you made off with a loaf of bread might be your inner self owning up to gluttony in waking life, or it might simply be hunger talking. But either way, it seemed wiser to confess and be safe. Monks and nuns frequently kept accounts of their dreams and brought them to those above them in the spiritual hierarchy. A fortunate few were honored for receiving holy visions in their sleep, while others were gently advised to cut back on onions before bed. Dreams, naturally, were more than spiritual riddles. They also served beautifully as storytelling tools. The literature of the period brims with dream sequences in which knights cross paths with angels, demons, or symbolic beasts, reciting verse about virtue. In a sense, dreams were the medieval equivalent of an evening's entertainment, only with a great deal more allegory and far fewer happy endings. The Church, true to form, regarded all of this with wariness. Not every dream was thought to come from above. Some were believed to be slipped into sleeping minds by demons hoping to lead the innocent astray. To dream of something unwholesome might signal that your soul was under siege, or merely that you had once again bedded down too near the smoke of the fire. These days, plenty of people allow their pets to share the bed, a comforting if sometimes pungent arrangement. In the Middle Ages, though, bedding down beside an animal was no charming personal preference. It was a way of staying warm. Consider the circumstances. Medieval houses were not designed with coziness in mind, what with their stone walls, complete absence of insulation, and draughts so fierce they might as well have been given names, and the closest thing to central heating was often the household pig. In the homes of common folk, it was perfectly ordinary for people and their animals to occupy a single room, on occasion the same bed, and very often the same heap of straw. Chickens roamed where they pleased, dogs settled at one's feet, and pigs grunted quietly near the hearth. And on a good night, none of them sank their teeth into you before morning. This had little to do with sentiment. Though medieval people did hold a genuine fondness for their animals, it was a matter of survival. Animals threw off heat. They were warm and reliable, and unlike certain relatives, they never stole the blanket. A sizable dog could keep your feet from going numb, and a cow standing in the corner might lift the temperature of the room by a degree or two, which in the depths of January felt like nothing short of a blessing. The dwellings of the poorer classes especially tended to consist of a single room that served every purpose at once, for cooking and eating and sleeping, and now and then for dying, and everyone in the household, whether human or beast, shared that one space. A child might be tucked in between a parent and a goat, and a chicken might function as an unscheduled alarm. As for hygiene, it is best not to inquire too closely. Wealthier families lived rather differently. Nobles did not, as a rule, sleep alongside livestock, though they might still keep a lapdog in the bed, kept there not for its warmth but for fashion, and, less charmingly, for the way it spread fleas about. A handful of castles even set aside their own sleeping quarters for favoured animals, because little proclaims power quite like a dog with its own chamber and a title to match. The arrangement had its disadvantages, of course. Animals are noisy, they wander, and history does not record them as respecters of personal space. Yet medieval people simply adapted, and a hoof to the face at 3 a.m. came to be regarded as part of the ordinary business of going to bed. If you have ever crowded into a shared room at a hostel and found the whole thing rather too much, allow a proper introduction to the medieval monastic dormitory, a place where comfort went quietly to its end beneath a vow of silence. Monasteries placed no value on private space or on softness or on anything resembling fun. The usual dormitory held dozens of monks all sleeping together in one great room, laid out in tidy rows like exceptionally virtuous sardines. The beds, if the word can be stretched to cover them, were commonly wooden planks, sometimes graced with a straw mattress when the abbot felt charitable or a feast day was at hand. One slept fully dressed, not out of any sense of decency, but because struggling into one's clothes in the dark at 2 a.m. for prayers proved more wretched than simply going to bed ready for them. The monastic habit, robe and belt and sandals together served at once as a kind of spiritual armour and as deeply inadequate insulation. When the cold came, you added layers. When the heat came, you endured it, because there was nothing to remove. There were no pillows, no curtains for privacy, and absolutely no conversation. Under the rule of St. Benedict, silence was not a polite recommendation, but a requirement, and if you turned over with too loud a groan, you might find yourself assigned to chamber pot duty for a week. Snoring occupied a murkier territory, since you could hardly govern it, yet if it grew disruptive, the Lord might hold you to account for it, or at the very least your roommates would. Light was kept to a minimum, perhaps a single candle, on the reasoning that you had no need to see, you needed only to lie still and refrain from sin, and that was the whole of the ambition. For all its harshness, the monks held that their stark beds were a rehearsal for the life to come, a way of readying the soul for its journey by refusing the body any comfort. Sleep was treated not as a pleasure, but as a necessity to be supervised and timetabled like everything else. Some monks went so far as to sleep sitting upright, the better to avoid any trace of luxury or dreams or healthy circulation. Set against all this, a peasant's pile of straw and a snoring pig begin to look almost indulgent, and at least the pig passed no judgment. Now consider something that would appall most sleepers today, the practice of rising on purpose at 2 a.m, not for a trip to the privy or to stare idly into the dark, but for prayer, loud and cold and lit by candlelight. In the monasteries of the Middle Ages, this was simply how things were done. Monks and nuns lived by a strict daily framework built around the canonical hours, among them matins, the first office of the day, and by day what was meant was the very blackest stretch of night, the hour when even the owls had not made up their minds about waking. The bell would sound, often rung by whoever had drawn the unlucky lot, and the whole dormitory of robed and weary souls would file off to the chapel in silence, still fully clothed, since pyjamas had no place in monastic life, and the only layering anyone believed in was of the spiritual sort. Within the chapel, by the wavering of candlelight and beneath the echo of the stone vaulting, they would chant the psalms, recite scripture, and do their utmost not to drift off where they stood, which was, as it happens, a genuine danger. There are records of monks being disciplined for nodding off in the middle of prayer, usually with the reward of extra chores or further devotions, so that falling asleep during matins might earn you the privilege of leading the next one. Matins could run an hour or longer, and certain especially zealous orders drew it out to 2, so picture the effort of remaining spiritually alert, while your stomach reminds you that supper had been a bowl of lentils, accompanied by a moral lesson, and your body begins shutting itself down. Afterward, the monks would either return to their beds for a second sleep, or, in the more rigorous houses, pass straight into study or labour, because nothing quite embodies holy discipline like threshing wheat on 4 broken hours of rest. The reasoning behind the early hour was to surrender comfort, and to give over the first and stillest part of the night to God, untroubled by the lures of daylight, or warmth, or a full cycle of dreams. It made for a striking emblem of devotion. At least once you had made peace with the numb feet, the candle smoke, and Brother Ambrose's tuneless chanting. In our own age, sleeping alone tends to be cast as something of a privilege, a mark of independence and quiet, or at the very least command over the blanket. In the medieval world, by contrast, sleeping alone was viewed as suspect, impractical, and frankly unsafe. Begin again with warmth. Beds, as we have already established, were hardly cosy. Stone walls and open chimneys did little to hold any heat, and central heating lay several plagues away in the future. So people shared their beds for the warmth of other bodies, not out of closeness, but out of plain thermal necessity. Children slept with their siblings and their parents, and sometimes with a visiting neighbour's child, rather like a sleepover at which no one had thought to ask whether you wished to attend. Yet warmth was not the only consideration, for there was a spiritual logic to sleeping in company. Many held that the devil did his busiest work by night, and that a soul alone in the dark might lie open to temptation, or worse still, to possession. Having others close by formed a sort of moral buffer, so that if anything went amiss, someone at least would witness it, or seize the demon before it took hold. For children, being alone at night was very nearly unthinkable, not only for the sake of comfort, but because ghosts and fairies and roaming spirits were all understood to belong to the ordinary furniture of the night. The old tales warned against sleeping by oneself as an open door to mischief and spiritual harm. And unlike the bedtime stories of today, these did not conclude with an embrace, but with a disappearance. Even married couples often shared their beds with children, with servants, or with whatever guest happened to be passing through, since privacy was less a custom than a notion the modern world would later invent. Within religious houses, too, monks generally slept in common, and to be assigned a bed of one's own was frequently a matter of discipline, so that in certain cases sleeping alone was quite literally a punishment. The logic running that solitude in bed offered too fine an opportunity for sin while. Indeed, the picture of 2 people sleeping alone in some enormous bed would have struck people as either extravagantly wasteful or profoundly suspicious. Sleeping in a group ensured a measure of public accountability. If you have ever dozed off sitting upright in a lecture, a carriage, or a dentist's waiting room, you most likely woke with a stiff neck and a wave of regret. In the Middle Ages, however, sleeping in an upright position was no mishap but a deliberate way of life. Some people of the period, the wealthy and the devoutly religious in particular, chose to sleep propped up rather than stretched out flat, and the reasons, though several, were none of them especially restful. There was, first, a medical conviction that lying flat did harm to the digestion, to the lungs, or to the general equilibrium of the bodily humours, and in a world where physicians supposed a sneeze might rearrange the soul, such reasoning seemed entirely sound. Sleeping upright, they held, warded off a congestion of the brain, which sounds rather alarming, but amounted mostly to a wish not to drown in one's own phlegm. There were, second, spiritual worries. To lie flat was thought to resemble too nearly the posture of the dead, and one had no wish to confuse the Almighty, or worse, to draw the notice of the angel of death by adopting the very position used at funerals. Superstition, beyond a doubt. But when the parish priest also served as the community's medical authority, you chose your battles with care. And so people often slept half reclined, held up by great bolsters and pillows, or by the wooden headboard that functioned as a medieval approximation of a reclining chair. The monks carried the idea further still, and in the stricter orders they might sleep sitting upright on a bench or propped against a cold wall with nothing but a hood to soften the discomfort. For the point was never health but discipline. Too much comfort might lead to dreams. Dreams might lead. Nobles sometimes had their beds fitted with angled supports to keep themselves in a half-seated pose, ideal for digesting the evening's meat pie or for warding off any surprise assault by demons. To sin, and sin of course, led to confession at 5 in the morning. None of this, it hardly needs saying, was in pursuit of good rest, but rather of virtue, of hardship, and of a faintly bewildering theology. Set aside, then, the haunted dreams and the goblins beneath the bed, for to medieval people the true monsters of the night were already there among the bedding, small and relentless and entirely indifferent to anyone's prayers. We are speaking, naturally, of fleas, of lice, and of the unofficial mascot of the medieval bedroom, the bedbug. Hygiene, it has to be said plainly, was never one of medieval Europe's gifts. Bathing happened seldom. Washing clothes was a costly affair, and the soap that did exist was sometimes cooked up from ingredients it is kinder not to describe. Combine all of that with mattresses stuffed with straw, bedding passed between many bodies, and now and then a hen wandering across the floor, and you had laid out, quite unintentionally, an open feast for every small crawling thing. Fleas and lice were so constant a presence that they may as well have signed a lease. Common folk simply lived alongside them as a matter of routine. And the wealthy, for all their feather beds and smooth coverlets, were given no special pardon. Indeed, certain grand households kept servants whose entire purpose was the picking of lice from a master's hair and garments, a position one might wryly imagine announced as keeper of the noble scalp. Bedbugs were the quieter menace of the night, tucking themselves into the joints of wooden frames, into the seams of mattresses, even into the narrow gaps of stone walls, then slipping out once it was dark to take their fill like the smallest of bloodthirsty visitors. So when you wonder why so many people of that age wore caps to bed and lay down still wearing their day clothes, warmth was only part of the story. Often enough it was simple armour against the biting things. Their remedies wandered from the faintly useful to the gloriously misguided. Some homes set strong-scented herbs smouldering, wormwood or tansy, hoping the smell would drive the pests off. Others tucked garlic, onions, or even ashes into the bedding, which likely troubled the insects very little while doing wonders to discourage any closeness between bedfellows. And the bother was not only of the body. Fleas carried a heavier meaning too, taken by many as little emblems of sin and stained virtue, small stinging reminders of humanity's fall, and perhaps of careless housekeeping besides. Whole poems were composed about them, some stern and moralizing, others oddly tender, since apparently nothing whispered devotion quite like the wish that two lovers be joined as closely as the flea that has tasted them both. So, where our nights are broken by glowing screens and the glare of a street lamp, theirs were far more likely undone by scratching, by twitching, and by the faint and entirely accurate sense that something was making its way along the shin. Sleepless nights are nothing new to any of us. but consider trying to drift off beneath the weight of 100 pounds of iron, for in the Middle Ages a few people did precisely that, as though the surest path to pleasant dreams lay in being ready to ride into a joust without ever rising. To be fair, the picture should be drawn carefully. The great majority, knights very much included, did not make a habit of sleeping fully armoured. It was stifling, it was heavy, and it clattered with every movement. Turning over in a coat of mail is rather like attempting a nap inside a sack of kitchen knives. Yet when war was close, or when one rested in unfriendly country, lying down half-armoured was reckoned the wiser gamble, with comfort treated as a luxury and survival as the actual goal. A man on campaign might set aside only his helmet and his gauntlets, leaving his mail shirt or breastplate in place, against the chance that the enemy fancied an uninvited visit by night. There is a particular indignity in being woken by hoofbeats and fumbling into your gear while still half lost in a dream about turnips. Within castles under siege, the men-at-arms might keep a sword or an axe lying beside them, a rather pointed sort of comfort to fall asleep next to. Iron does not breathe, mail has an unkind way of pinching the skin, and once you add cold stone underfoot, the thinnest of bedding, and the steady accompaniment of snoring companions and sputtering torches, you arrive at sleeping quarters that rank somewhere below a crowded waiting hall on any. A shield might serve in place of a pillow, and should the walls be breached, there was at least the small consolation of not needing to dress for the occasion. Such priorities had their cost, of course, since rest of that kind restored very little. Scale of comfort. Even those well away from any fighting sometimes kept a little protection about them when bedding down in lawless places. A merchant on the road or a guard between watches might doze in a gambeson, one of those thick quilted coats that gave a measure of defence and, as a happy bonus, rather more cushioning than prayer alone could provide. And one must not forget how very loud armour could be. A single careless roll might set off such a clamour that everyone nearby startled awake, each one privately certain the end of the world had come round once again. In an age where nightly demons, beds full of lice, and the odd pig underfoot were all simply part of ordinary life, it would be reasonable to assume sleepwalking counted as just one more small nuisance among many. But the reality was a good deal more theatrical than that. Should you happen to rise and wander while still asleep, no one in the Middle Ages put it down to worry or weariness. They concluded instead that you were possessed, that you had been bewitched, or perhaps that you had some lingering quarrel with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation if you wished to sound learned before the parish monk, was little understood and widely dreaded. The notion that a person could rise from a straw pallet, drift across the room, and stand gazing at nothing on the wall struck people less as a harmless quirk of sleep, and more as some private rehearsal staged by the devil himself. Records that survive suggest people were truly unsettled by those who walked in their sleep. Imagine the scene: a figure in a long nightshirt, a candle wavering in one hand, the eyes vacant, the mouth murmuring Latin. The sleeper had never actually learned, all while stepping carefully over the livestock. Ghost, you might think, or heretic, or quite possibly both. And depending on the temperament of the local priest, an exorcism could find its way onto the morning's schedule before anyone had eaten. Some held that the wandering was brought on by an imbalance of the humours, an excess of black bile in particular, that being the ready explanation for nearly anything that defied understanding. Others supposed the soul slipped loose for a time during sleep, leaving the body to amble about on its own like a mule that no one was watching. To put a stop to these nocturnal excursions, people reached for everything within grasp, from herbal draughts and prayers murmured over the bed, to iron charms hung nearby, to the plainly practical country solution of binding the sleeper's leg to a chair. If that strikes you as harsh, remember that many a medieval home held an open hearth, blades left within easy reach, and a chamber pot poised for some unfortunate overturning. In one stranger thread of these tales, there were whispers of people scaling rooftops while fast asleep. Whether such stories were true or stretched in the retelling, the fear of dreamers taking flight led to bars across windows and the occasional solemn debate among the learned over whether a soul could commit sin while wholly unconscious. Mercifully, most who walked in their sleep did no more than pace, mutter, or paw at doors that were not there. Yet if one of them happened to wander into a church, the townsfolk might read it as a message from heaven, or summon a cleansing rite simply to leave no spiritual stone unturned. If life in those centuries instructed people in anything, it was the art of sleeping straight through bedlam. Church bells, rolling thunder, livestock in full voice, the occasional siege at the gate, to the perpetually weary souls of the Middle Ages, these were merely the sounds of the background, their own version of soothing white noise. Take the bells to begin with. They rang out to mark each holy moment the day held, the rising of the sun, the appointed hours of prayer, the taking of meals, and naturally that most unwelcome summons of matins at 2 or 3 in the morning. To live anywhere within earshot of a monastery was to have your dreams scored by steady tolling, until at last the mind simply made its peace with the sound, and the bells became the lullaby of an overburdened spirit. Nor was it the bells alone. Storms came often and carried real terror, for without any forecast to consult, or any sturdy modern glass at the window, every roll of thunder felt as though it might be the last the world would ever hear. Roofs let in the rain, shutters trembled, and chimneys wailed like mourners. Still the people slept, because they had no other choice. The work of living paused for no one's insomnia, and neither did the ploughing, nor the praying, nor, in their day, the fleeing from raiders along the coast. On that note, even invasions and the air of impending doom did not always spell the end of a night's rest. Through the 14th century, people somehow went on sleeping through famine, through war, and through the Black Death itself. When the carts of the dead passed by in the morning, it was taken more as a grim sort of alarm clock than as cause for fresh panic, and if a person failed to wake at all, there were those who quietly counted that a mercy. There are even accounts of folk who slept on through earthquakes, through fires in the barn, through mobs gathered in anger. A shortage of sleep was the common condition, and the body learned to make do. When your hours ran from first light to last, when you ate barely enough to keep upright, and when your days were spent dodging mud, taxes, and the threat of eternal damnation, sleep came down upon you hard and without ceremony. And then there were those who turned sleep into a quiet escape, who, faced with sickness, with grief, or with the fear that the world was about to end, a thing predicted in roughly every generation, simply gathered a cloak around themselves, breathed out a prayer, and lay down for a while. There is a curious thread of wisdom running through that. In the winter of 1692, the village of Salem in Massachusetts lay beneath far more than its blanket of snow. It lay beneath a weight of tension, of mistrust, of a hushed and creeping dread that worked its way into the timber-framed houses and out across the frozen fields. The villagers were Puritans, severe in their faith, devout, and steeped in superstition. They believed themselves to be raising a holy settlement out of the wilderness, a shining town upon a hill, kept under the eye of God and prowled around by Satan. Existence had been hard enough already. The village had lately broken away from Salem town over matters of politics and religion. Harvests had come to nothing. Smallpox had torn through neighbouring settlements. Conflicts with native peoples had left a great many shaken. There were quarrels between neighbours, bitter disputes over inheritance, and a deep-seated distrust of strangers, or indeed of anyone who failed to fit the expected shape. Lay over all of this the long, dark, biting New England winter, and something was certain to give way at last. That breaking point arrived in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister of the village. His daughter Betty, 9 years old, and his niece Abigail Williams, 11, began to act in ways no one could account for. They shrieked without restraint. They flung objects across the room. They twisted their bodies into shapes that seemed against nature. Then they would lapse into long stretches of silence, their eyes stretched wide with fright. The neighbours murmured that the children had been cursed. The girls themselves insisted that unseen forces were pinching and biting them. Reverend Parris, at a loss for what should be done, summoned a local physician named William Griggs, who, after searching in vain for any bodily cause, handed down the verdict that would tick the whole village into turmoil. Witchcraft. That one word fell like a spark into fears that had long been smouldering across Salem. In a community where witches were held to be real and dangerous agents of the devil, the suggestion seemed anything but absurd. And now, if the devil had managed to creep into the minister's very own home, what could that possibly mean for everyone else? The girls, encouraged by adults and by other children alike, began to give out names. The earliest accusations landed on women already living at the edges, the social misfits and the cast aside. But before long those accusations would climb higher, reaching the respectable, the well-off, even the most pious among them. Salem was only a small village, yet what was about to unfold there would resound far past its boundaries. What began as murmurs in the dark would harden into cries from the foot of the gallows, and into a legacy of suspicion that lingers in America's histories to this day. Once the thought of witchcraft had taken hold in Salem, it crept outward like ivy, silent at the start and then choking everything it wrapped around. The afflicted girls, Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, soon joined by others such as Ann Putnam the younger and Mercy Lewis, appeared to grow more daring with each day that passed. They writhed in the courtroom, they cried out during prayers, and they declared they could see dark spirits drifting above certain households. This was no mere flight of childish fancy. It was performed, it was public, and most unsettling of all, it was believed. Those first marked out were the ones with the least to shield them, women who already stood apart from respectable society. Sarah Good, a beggar without a home, was known to mutter under her breath when she was turned away from a door, and people decided her muttering must be a curse. She smoked a pipe. She spoke sharply to children. She matched the imagined shape of a witch precisely because she failed to match the imagined shape of a proper Puritan woman. Sarah Osborne had not set foot in church for over a year, and had scandalized her neighbours by wedding her indentured servant after her first husband's death, a woman who flouted convention and was, in their eyes, plainly to be suspected. And Tituba, the enslaved woman within Reverend Parris's house, seemed the most foreign of them all. She had come from Barbados, and her tales, her manner of speech, and the folklore she carried frightened the villagers. Under pressure, and very possibly under physical blows, Tituba confessed to witchcraft. Yet rather than settling the matter, her confession threw it wide open. She spoke of a tall man dressed in black, a figure tied in their minds to the devil, who had asked her to set her name in a book. The slave was Tituba, not Tatuba. The governor was William Phipps, not Phipps. The court was Oya and Termina, not Terminina. The judges were Samuel Sewell and William Staunton. The minister was George Burroughs. The pressing punishment was Pine forte et dura. and increased Mother Martha. She told of strange creatures she had seen, of yellow birds, of red cats, and even of ghostly dogs. But there is a clear factual issue threaded through this chunk: the names. This is the Salem witch trials. And Giles Corey, Mary Esty, etc. I will quietly correct these spellings while rewording everything. Most condemning of all, though, was the way Tituba insisted she had not acted alone, that other witches walked among the people of Salem. For a frightened court, those few words were enough. The door she had pushed open could not be closed again, and others poured through behind her. Hardly a week passed without fresh names being spoken aloud. Neighbour turned against neighbour, and old resentments wrapped themselves in the language of holy duty. A quarrel over a fence line became a tale of unseen torment. When a cow sickened and died for no obvious reason, witchcraft was blamed. When an infant fussed in the middle of a prayer, the devil was said to be at work. The dread spread so thoroughly that even the blameless learned to hold their tongues, for to stand up for an accused person was to draw the same suspicion onto yourself. Quiet was the only shelter left. And so the tangle of accusations stretched wider and wider, snaring the whole village in its faint, sticky threads, while reason slipped away and panic took the reins. As the charges piled higher and the village seemed ready to boil over, the colonial authorities intervened. Governor William Phipps, freshly installed in his office and anxious to be seen restoring order, set up a special court to deal with the disorder. It was given the name the Court of Oyer and Terminer, a phrase borrowed from Old Legal French meaning, roughly, to hear and to decide. In practice, though, it became something closer to a workshop for justice run on fear. The court first gathered in Salem town in June of 692, and it was no ordinary bench. Its procedures had been twisted by the general terror. Rather than insisting on solid proof or trustworthy witnesses, it permitted something far more perilous, what came to be called spectral evidence. Spectral evidence meant a sworn claim that the spirit, or spectre, of the accused had tormented the victim. Put plainly, if someone said they had seen your ghostly shape in a dream, pressing the breath from their throat, that account could be entered against you in open court. It made no difference that the accused might have been sitting in church at the time, or many miles away. It was the spirit, they insisted, carrying out the devil's errands. A dream cannot be questioned, and worse still, a dream cannot be disproven. Children had become the leading voices in these proceedings, and their fits, their shrieks, their gasping in the courtroom grew more dramatic with each passing session. One of these girls, Mary Walcott, would crumple into convulsions the instant a suspected witch was brought before her. If the prisoner glanced her way, she screamed. If the prisoner looked elsewhere, she screamed all the louder. The display held everyone spellbound, and the magistrates, among them the well-regarded Judge Samuel Sewell and the stern Chief Justice William Staunton, took it all as truth. There were no lawyers for the defence, for the very idea did not exist in the colonial courts of that day. Once accused, you stood entirely on your own. Deny the charge, and the afflicted girls would twist and writhe as if in torment. Confess to it, and you might keep your life, but only if you were willing to hand over the names of others. The whole arrangement paid out for falsehood and came down hard on silence. Worse than that, the trials hardened into public entertainment. Onlookers travelled in from the surrounding towns simply to watch. The accused were marched into the courtroom in irons, frequently confused, frequently poor, and almost always without any power to protect themselves. And yet doubt had not vanished altogether. A few in the village murmured among themselves that the girls were only pretending. Others wondered quietly why the finger of blame seemed to fall on certain kinds of people more than others. But almost no one said such things aloud, for to challenge the court was understood to be challenging the will of God himself. In Salem, sound judgment had been set aside, and the law had turned into a mirror that gave back fear instead of justice. On the 10th of June, 692, the gallows outside Salem took its first life, that of Bridget Bishop. Scandal was nothing new to her. She wore garments of bright red, she kept a tavern, and she had been suspected of witchcraft years before any of this began, all of which made her an easy mark. At her trial, neighbours swore that her spirit had pinched them in the dark, that their babies had died after she walked past, and that she hid enchanted poppets in her home. She denied each charge, and still the court declared her guilty. They led her up to Gallows Hill, a bare and wind-scoured stretch of ground just beyond the town. There was no final prayer, no last mercy. The rope was drawn tight, the crowd looked on, and with that one death, the machinery of execution shuddered into motion. The hangings that came after arrived in quick succession. On the 19th of July, 5 more women went to the gallows: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some of them had stood in good standing within the church. The case of Rebecca Nurse was especially hard to comprehend, for she was elderly, devout, and dearly loved by her neighbours. The jury had even returned a verdict of not guilty at first, only to reverse itself under the weight of the court's displeasure and the howling of the afflicted girls. Her last words drifted out like a quiet warning that she was as innocent as a child still unborn. It changed nothing. The noose drew no distinctions. August brought still more executions, and then came the 22nd of September, the bloodiest single day, when 8 people were hanged in one morning. Among them was Martha Corey, who had spoken her doubts about the trials early on, and her husband, Giles Corey, who met a stranger and crueler end. Giles refused to enter any plea at all. Because the court could not put a man on trial without one, it reached back for an old English penalty, peine forte et dure, the pressing. Stones were laid upon his chest, one after another over the course of 3 days, slowly and without pity. His last words, so the story goes, were a demand for more weight. When the madness had finally run its course, 19 people had been hanged, 1 had been pressed to death, and at least 5 more had died in the jails while they waited for trials that never helped them. Dozens confessed to lies in order to keep breathing. More than 200 people in all had been accused. The gallows threw a long shadow across Salem, not only over the hill itself, but over every heart in the village. Fear had taken the place of law, and justice, with its eyes covered, had been led up to the scaffold. While the executions drew all the attention, hundreds of others languished in cramped and foul-smelling jails, waiting on a verdict or on some miracle that rarely came. Salem's little jail could never hold them all, so accused witches were sent off to nearby towns such as Ipswich and Boston, where they were chained to walls, left hungry, left cold, and very nearly forgotten. The great majority of them were neither witches nor even oddities on the edge of the community. They were ordinary neighbours, friends, parents and children whose only real offence had been falling into a dispute with the wrong person or owning a piece of land that someone else coveted. Again and again, private grudges dressed themselves up as divine judgment. A pig strayed into a neighbour's yard and died there, so it must have been witchcraft. A man refused to help cut firewood, so clearly he had cursed the axe. Mary Esty, a sister of the executed Rebecca Nurse, was one of those caught in this way. She was a respected mother of 7, well known for her devotion. The court let her go at first, only to seize her again a few days later when the afflicted girls fell into fresh fits, and that second arrest decided her fate. In a last petition to the judges, she pleaded, not for her own life, but that they bring these proceedings to a halt before any more innocent blood was spilled. She was hanged not long after. Another case that lingers in the memory was that of Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good. After her mother was arrested, the little girl was questioned, and under pressure she confessed to being a witch. Her frightened, half-sensible answers were written down as truth, and she was kept in chains for some 8 months. By the time she was finally let out, her mind had been broken, and she never truly recovered from what had been done to her. Expectant mothers were not spared either. Elizabeth Proctor, whose husband John Proctor would himself be hanged, was found guilty and condemned to die. Because she was carrying a child, however, her execution was postponed, and that delay almost certainly saved her, for she gave birth within the jail and was released once the trials had ended. The accusations went on multiplying. Some of the accused, desperate to escape the gallows, confessed and then named others, hoping to turn suspicion away from themselves. Whole families were dragged into the descending spiral, fathers, wives, daughters, none of them safely out of reach. The jails, meanwhile, filled past any reasonable limit. Food ran short, sickness moved easily through the crowded cells, and some died still waiting for a trial, lost in a kind of legal twilight ruled by suspicion. And still each week brought new names. In Salem it had ceased to matter who you actually were, only who was prepared to speak your name aloud. The turning came when the accusations grew too bold for their own good. People who had once stood firmly behind the trials suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of them. The Reverend George Burroughs, who had formerly served as a minister in Salem, was arrested and charged with being the very ringleader of the witches. He was learned, well-spoken, and had clashed in earlier years with some of the village's more powerful families, and that alone was apparently enough. But on the day set for his execution, Burroughs did something that startled everyone present. Standing upon the gallows, he recited the Lord's Prayer from beginning to end without a single stumble, a feat that witches were widely believed to be incapable of performing. The crowd went quiet. A few wept. Even men hardened to such scenes were visibly shaken, and yet the execution was carried out all the same. Still, that moment had planted a seed of doubt that would not be pulled up. Then came an accusation against Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps himself. All at once the hysteria had climbed to the very top of the colony's social order. Phipps, already uneasy under the mounting criticism and disorder, finally moved to act. In October of 692 he dissolved the Court of Oyer and Termina, bringing the pending trials and executions to a stop. Increase Mather, among the most respected theologians in the colony, condemned the use of spectral evidence, declaring that it would be better for 10 suspected witches to escape than for one innocent person to be condemned, a startling thought in a place that had spent months believing the precise. The public mood had turned. Ministers who had been silent or quietly complicit now began to raise their voices. Opposite, people who had once applauded the trials began to question them. The jails were still crowded, but the hunger for more blood had dulled. Too many respected figures had been accused, and too many innocent people had already been laid in the ground. The villagers were beginning to grasp that this had never been divine justice at all. It had been madness. Others simply withdrew from public view, and those who had shouted loudest now lowered their eyes. The fear had not truly gone, but it had worn itself out. The people longed for steadiness, the officials wished to save what reputation they could, and Salem, bruised and ashamed, was finally ready to wake from its long nightmare. The storm was breaking, though the damage it left behind had already been done. By the closing months of 1692, the legal apparatus that had driven the hysteria was buckling under the sheer weight of its own absurdity. With the Court of Oyer and Termina dissolved in October, a new and far more careful body, the Superior Court of Judicature, was assembled in the early part of 1693. This time the rules had changed. Spectral evidence was no longer permitted, and the judges regarded the wild claims of the accusers with open skepticism. The effect was immediate, the convictions slowed to a crawl. Many of the accused were acquitted on the spot. Of the cases brought before this new court, the great majority ended in release. And even some who had already confessed began to take back their words, admitting that fear, rough treatment, or sheer pressure had driven them to lie. The dramatic performances of the afflicted girls had lost their old power to persuade. One of the most telling moments in this unravelling involved the Reverend Samuel Willard, a respected minister who himself fell under suspicion. He was never formally charged, but the very notion that so devout and high-standing a man could be suspected at all laid bare how arbitrary and rotten the whole process had grown. The court that had once been ferocious was now cautious in everything it did. It began quietly setting prisoners free, first those against whom there had been little evidence, and in time even those who had confessed to witchcraft under duress. Meanwhile, the families of the executed started to press for justice. John Proctor's children petitioned for the return of his confiscated property, and Rebecca Nurse's relatives mounted a campaign to clear her name. Slowly, the village's shame came to stand where its fear had been. Congregations split apart, long friendships were severed. The very weave of Salem's social order had been torn through. Governor Phipps, alert now to the growing embarrassment the colony was suffering abroad, pardoned the prisoners who remained in 693. But even freedom carried a price, for many families were made to pay their own jail fees before they could be released, losing their homes, their health, and very nearly their lives, only to be handed a bill for the privilege of having survived at all. By the end of it all, the toll was staggering. 19 souls sent to the gallows, 1 man slowly crushed beneath stones, 5 more lost while waiting in their cells, and upward of 200 names dragged into the web of accusation. The court did not merely fall apart, it caved inward upon itself, leaving behind a hollow filled with remorse, sorrow, and disbelief. The proceedings had come to a close, yet whatever mending might follow had not so much as begun. Salem was now a place permanently reshaped by the lives it had surrendered, the fairness it had cast aside, and the unflattering reflection it could no longer avoid. The hanging tree stood quiet, and the cells had been cleared, but quiet was not the same as peace. It was not the dead who troubled the town, but the conscience of the living. Something that began with a few ailing children had swollen into a shared act of ruin. Households had been split open, good names dragged through the mud, blameless people put to death. Now those left behind were forced to dwell among the rubble of it. Former neighbours found they could not meet one another's gaze. People who had once knelt in prayer side by side had stood in court and spoken against each other. Some of the afflicted girls slipped quietly out of town. Others simply receded from view. A handful, among them Anne Putnam the younger, would eventually voice their regret. In the year 1706, she rose before her congregation and offered a public apology for the part she had played, laying the blame on a deception worked upon her by Satan. Yet for a great many, no apology could reach the depth of the harm. Those who had served the court carried their own weight as well. Judge Samuel Sewell, among the most prominent of the men who had presided, was one of the rare few willing to confess that he had done wrong. In an extraordinary gesture of public contrition, he stood through a church service in 1697 as a minister read aloud his written confession and his plea to be forgiven. It was an uncommon flicker of accountability in an age when most preferred simply to look away and let the matter fade. But fading proved difficult. The families of those who had been condemned began to press for redress. As the years passed, petition after petition reached the government of Massachusetts, requesting formal pardons, the return of seized property, and an open admission that the executed had been innocent all along. The response came slowly. In 1711, the colony enacted a measure that restored the rights and reputations of some among the victims and extended modest financial repayment to their heirs. Even so, it did not reach everyone. Certain families, the Coreys and the Proctors among them, were passed over entirely. Talk of witchcraft never fully departed from New England, but in Salem the shame became woven into the very identity of the place. The village would in time take a new name, Danvers, perhaps hoping to set some distance between itself and its notorious history. Gallows Hill was never formally marked, almost as though the town wished to bury not only the dead, but the recollection of what had been done there. Yet the memory held on regardless, carried in sermons, repeated in stories, settling into the silences that now hung between people who had once been friends. Salem had not been laid low by witches, it had been laid low by fear, by pride, and by power that no one had thought to restrain. And that affliction would linger long after the last execution. More than 3 centuries have passed since the trials ended, yet their echo has not faded, sounding not only through textbooks and guided tours, but through the way we still think about justice, about fear, and about how easily the truth can be broken. What unfolded in 1692 was more than a curious outbreak of mass delusion. It was the failure of reason, of mercy, and of legal honesty all at once, under the pressure of panic. Ordinary people, farmers and midwives and ministers, became executioners simply by believing too readily and asking too little. The courts that existed to shield the innocent were turned into instruments of harm. Faith was made into a weapon. Sworn testimony became performance. And to remain silent was treated as proof of guilt. Among the most unsettling features of the whole affair is how swiftly it ran its course. Within the span of mere months, fear outran fact. Old resentments, dressed up as a battle against evil spirits, hardened into sentences of death. No demons were required, no actual devils, only the conviction that they were near. The trials did leave behind lessons paid for at terrible cost, lessons that would carry forward through the generations. In the years and centuries to come, Salem would be invoked again and again in arguments over fair process and the liberties owed to every person. The Constitution of the United States, set down nearly 100 years afterward, would expressly forbid such things as laws applied to acts after the fact and bills of attainder, the very sorts of measures that had effectively sealed the fate of the accused in Salem. The promise of legal counsel, the right to confront one's accuser, and the demand for real and tangible evidence were hard-won principles shaped in part out of what had happened on Gallows Hill. In our own time, the phrase witch hunt has come to stand for political persecution or moral panic, though it is often thrown about with little thought for the genuine terror those words once described. Salem was no figure of speech. It was a real town where real people were hanged for crimes that existed only in imagination, betrayed by the very systems meant to protect them. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is the simplest. Fear left unchecked can grow into a tyranny of its own. And once fear is granted legitimacy by power, by courts and churches and governments, it becomes very nearly impossible to stop. The story of Salem stands as a warning, not merely of one village losing its reason, but of how readily reason gives way once fear is handed authority. The gallows are long gone and the courtrooms have fallen quiet, yet the caution remains. Truth is a fragile thing. Justice does not arrive on its own, and history tends to circle back upon itself unless we take care to remember. We turn now from one woman's age to another, and from New England to ancient Rome. Fulvia came into the world around the year 83 before the Common Era, born into the well-placed and somewhat unusual Fulvian family, an old plebeian house that had long before fought its way up into the highest ranks of Roman politics. The Fulvi were not among the most ancient of the patrician lines, yet they had furnished Rome with consuls, with generals, and with orators, and through their blood ran both ambition and a certain appetite for stirring things up. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was remembered less for any mark he left on politics than for the awkwardness of his speech. The name Bambalio itself pointed to his stammer. Fulvia, however, did not stammer at anything. She seemed made to give orders. From her earliest years, she would have lived steeped in the hard-edged world of Roman power. Senators and generals argued matters of state within her own home. Elections and betrayals were the ordinary news of the day. She would have understood early that politics was not waged only in the forum, but also in marriages, in funerals, in whispered rumours, and in deals struck behind closed doors. Women in the great Roman households were expected to be quiet companions, polished, well-read, and obedient. Fulvia would defy every one of those expectations. She was rich, deeply educated, and well-connected, and she was fully aware of it. Although the record of her younger days is thin, the things she would later do paint the picture of a young woman who watched closely, grasped politics by instinct, and feared nothing at all. She was not someone destined to blend into the scenery. She possessed a forceful character, a keen political mind, and a readiness to act even within the man's domain of Roman government. The age she grew up in was one of rare instability. The Republic was coming undone. Civil wars, uprisings of the common people, and the contests for supremacy among commanders such as Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar were turning Rome into something close to a sealed vessel under heat. The old order was crumbling, and Fulvia reached adulthood squarely in the thick of it. Instead of shrinking from the disorder, she would learn to turn it to her advantage. Her upbringing did not yield the modest matron that Rome held up as its ideal. It produced instead a woman who looked upon politics not as a male preserve to be dreaded, but as a field of battle to be won. She would marry 3 men of great power, each of them a daring figure in the history of Rome. Yet Fulvia would not merely wed power. She would direct armies, lead uprisings, and become the first Roman woman whose likeness appeared upon a coin, not in the guise of a goddess, but as herself. Rome was not prepared for Fulvia, though she was more than prepared for Rome. Fulvia's first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, and it was anything but ordinary. Clodius was no run-of-the-mill Roman nobleman. He was an agitator of the people, a political incendiary with a gift for chaos, scandal, and power drawn from the streets. To much of the Roman elite he was a menace. To the crowds he was a champion. And to Fulvia he was an opening worth taking. Their union, somewhere in the early 50s before the Common Era, joined her to the man who had made the Roman Republic into a stage for his own performances. Clodius was notorious for his theatrical contempt for tradition. He had once dressed himself as a woman in order to slip into a sacred rite open only to women, held in Caesar's own house, a scandal that somehow only lifted his standing higher. Later, he gave up his patrician rank in order to stand for the tribunate of the plebs, an office that carried the power to block the actions of the Senate. Clodius understood the politics of the Roman street better than nearly anyone, and Fulvia, far from being a passive wife at his side, stood right there with him. She was no silent partner. The Roman sources suggest that she took an active hand in her husband's political life, that she dealt with his followers, was seen during his campaigns, and ran their household as a centre of Clodian activity. Together they made a new sort of Roman couple, bold on the side of the people and unapologetically combative. But the partnership exacted its price. In 52 before the Common Era, Clodius was killed on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his rival, Titus Annius Milo. His death sent a tremor through Rome. Fulvia, however, had no intention of grieving in private. She arranged a political funeral that historians still discuss to this day. She carried Clodius's mangled body through the Roman Forum with his bloodied wounds left bare for everyone to see, calculated for the strongest possible effect. The public was both horrified and enraged. Riots broke out. The Senate house itself was set ablaze and burned to the ground. Fulvia had taken her private sorrow and forged it into a public rising. This was the first of her great political acts, and it succeeded. Her gift for steering the emotions of the crowd, for turning spectacle into strategy, and for wielding her dead husband's legacy as a weapon marked her as a new kind of force in Roman affairs. Clodius was gone, but Fulvia had stepped clear of his shadow, and Rome would never again look at her in the same way. She did not let herself linger in mourning. In Rome, political standing had a brief life, and no one grasped that more keenly than she did. Soon after the violent end of Clodius Pulcher, she entered a second marriage, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising figure in politics and one of Julius Caesar's most fervent backers. At first glance, Curio seemed an odd match. He had a showy reputation and a fondness for drama, yet underneath the flourish lay a shrewd political mind. As tribune of the plebs in 50 before the Common Era, Curio held tremendous sway during one of the most volatile stretches Rome had known. The Republic was balanced between war and peace, between the ambitions of Caesar and the resistance of the Senate. In Curio, Fulvia saw not simply a husband, but a passage to the next centre of power. This was no sentimental rebound. It was a marriage carefully reasoned out. With Clodius dead, Fulvia required a fresh political footing, someone able to carry on the popular cause her first husband had raised, and someone who enjoyed Caesar's support. Curio answered to both. Through him she stayed firmly entangled in the shifting balances of Roman power. She did not merely marry into the movement, she helped give it shape. Fulvia saw to it that Clodius's old supporters remained active, recasting their cause beneath Curio's leadership and keeping the masses of the city politically alive. But the Roman world was unravelling at speed. The strains between Caesar and Pompey erupted into open civil war. Curio flung himself into the conflict on Caesar's side, and Fulvia, as ever, stayed deeply involved in the politics of it, said to have helped rally support and organize resources for her husband's effort. In 49, before the Common Era, Curio led a military campaign into Africa to secure Caesar's position there, but it ended in catastrophe. He was caught in an ambush and killed by the forces of King Juba of Numidia. His death was brutal, and his army was destroyed. Once more Fulvia found herself a widow, and once more Rome waited to see whether she would slip quietly into the background. She did not. Curio's death only hardened her standing as a political widow of dangerous endurance. She had now lost 2 husbands to Rome's civil turmoil, and both had fallen in the service of popular causes. Yet Fulvia was nowhere near finished. Her boldest alliance, and the most dramatic chapter of her life, was still ahead of her. His third and most renowned marriage joined Fulvia to Mark Antony, the driven general who stood as one of Julius Caesar's most devoted partisans. When their union came about, somewhere around the year 47 before the Common Era, it was far more than a matter of the heart. It was a pooling of strength. Fulvia had already shown herself a true craftswoman of Rome's street-level politics, and Antony, climbing quickly through both the army and the offices of the state, needed exactly that sort of shrewd backing within the city itself. The two of them became one of the most formidable political pairs of the dying republic. By the day they wed, Fulvia was well acquainted with bloodshed and treachery, having laid 2 earlier husbands in their graves, and outwitted more rivals than could easily be counted. Antony, for his part, carried his own reputation for scandal, being a man who drank freely, wagered often, and lived a private life famous for its disorder. Yet in Fulvia he had discovered someone who offered more than amusement. She could guard what was his, keep his web of alliances from fraying, and gather his followers around her whenever he was away at war. And Antony, beneath all his bluster, recognized just how much she was worth to him. He let her hold a kind of authority that no woman of Rome had ever openly carried before. She broke the seals on his letters, she gave commands while he was absent, she sat in on councils and shaped who would be appointed to what. The Roman writers, who were nearly always against her, drew her as domineering and hungry for control, yet what truly unsettled them was not her ambition at all. It was that she conducted herself as a Roman man might, in a society that had simply never invented words for such a woman. When Caesar was struck down in the year 44 before the Common Era, the Republic tumbled back into disorder once more. Antony moved at once to fasten his grip on his claim as Caesar's political successor, but it was Fulvia who actually held the city of Rome in her hands. While Antony bound himself to Octavian and Lepidus in the second triumvirate, she stood as his agent in the capital, tending the networks of favour and obligation, working alongside the street gangs, and keeping Antony's supporters ready and roused. She even helped to seal Antony's formal patching up with Octavian by giving her daughter Clodia to him in marriage, a tie that would, in time, fall to pieces. To the public eye she appeared not merely as Antony's wife, but as the man himself by proxy. Coins were struck in Rome that carried both Antony's likeness and her name, a recognition of a woman's standing that had no precedent. She was not tucked away in the dim corners of power. She stood squarely in its full light. But authority in Rome was forever only on loan, and Fulvia was about to discover just how far a woman might travel before the city snapped back at her. As Mark Antony chased after his military ventures and his bargains across the breadth of the Roman world, it was Fulvia who kept her hand on the streets of Rome. She was not simply the man's wife, she was, in everything but the title, his regent. In an age held together by violence, by bribery, and by sheer naked influence, she showed that she could play the game as ably as anyone in the Senate, and most likely better. Rome in the wake of Caesar's murder was a battlefield where no swords were drawn, a place where power kept shifting like a target that would not stay still. Fulvia grasped this, and so she rooted Antony's authority in the capital by becoming his stand-in. She steered his allies, she handled the common people of the city, she struck bargains with the various factions, and, most daringly of all, she made war with words and with silver. She paid for troops who would stay loyal, she handed out bribes to keep the peace in the streets, and she made certain that whatever laws were passed leaned in Antony's favour. Certain of the ancient writers, the hostile ones above all, men such as Appian and Cassius Dio, render Fulvia as scheming, as a shrew, as a stirrer of wars. But beneath the layers of exaggeration and contempt for women lies simply a person doing the work of politics in a world that had drawn up no rules for a woman doing anything beyond her weaving and her grieving. She was assembling coalitions, throwing her weight behind military commanders, even handing down decrees, the very tasks ordinarily kept for senators and consuls. She showed herself in public as well, and she nurtured strong bonds with the veteran soldiers, a group whose loyalty mattered enormously in the struggles of the late Republic. With Antony off campaigning in the east, Fulvia was often the visible face of his power in Italy, meeting with the centurions, swaying the decisions about how land would be parcelled out, and reminding the soldiers that their devotion to Antony would not go unpaid. Yet all of this gathering of power carried a price. The Roman aristocracy, and most of all the faction that had attached itself to Octavian, Caesar's heir and Antony's ever more bitter rival, came to resent how far her influence stretched. To them she was a meddlesome woman who held far too much sway over legions, over laws, over loyalties. That she could act at all without a man to guard and govern her was not merely alarming, it had no precedent. And Fulvia was nobody's fool. She felt the strain growing between Antony and Octavian. She could see their alliance splitting along its seams, and she understood what neither man seemed yet to fully accept, that the Republic had no room enough for the two of them. So she began to ready herself for what came next, which was not negotiation but open confrontation. She had stood behind power long enough. Now she meant to take hold of it herself. In the year 41 before the Common Era, Fulvia did what no one expected. She went to war against Octavian, the man who would one day become Augustus, and she did not do so in any quiet fashion. With her husband still posted in the east, Fulvia, together with Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother and a sitting consul, took it upon themselves to defy Octavian's command of Italy. The stated reason was to safeguard Antony's interests and to protect the land owed to the Roman veterans who were loyal to him. But beneath that surface, Fulvia's hand could be seen everywhere. This was not politics alone. This was an armed uprising, led by a Roman woman, the first and only occasion in all of Rome's history when a woman would deliberately stir up and arrange a civil war. The struggle came to be called the Parisine War, and it was set off by Octavian's much disputed plan to redistribute land, a scheme that turned many Italians out of their holdings so that his soldiers might be rewarded. Fulvia took hold of the swelling resentment and cast Octavian as a tyrant, a betrayer of all that Caesar had stood for. With Lucius serving as her public voice within the Senate, and Fulvia arranging matters out of sight, the two of them gathered 8 legions and took the city of Perugia, the place known today as Perugia. Let there be no confusion about it, this was Fulvia's war. The ancient accounts hint that she threw herself into the fight more wholeheartedly than Lucius ever did. She roused the troops, she stirred the public, she even kept up correspondence with the generals. Rome hummed with talk of her commanding legions, issuing orders, and pushing Lucius into clashes he would rather have avoided. Octavian, caught off guard though he was, moved swiftly all the same. He laid siege to Perusia through the winter that bridged the years 41 and 40 before the Common Era, cutting off its supplies and grinding the city toward surrender. Fulvia, trapped between failing stores of food and the betrayals of her own politics, watched her daring wager come undone. By the early months of the year 40, the city gave way. Lucius Antonius was let go, in all likelihood as a courtesy meant to avoid offending Antony, but Fulvia was sent into exile. The woman who had once held the reins of riots and marriages and armies and the mood of the public was now judged too perilous to remain on Roman soil. She was dispatched to Sicyon in Greece, where she hoped to find Antony again. But Antony did not come hurrying to her. The once mighty bond between husband and wife had worn thin amid the haze of war and the long miles between them. She had acted in his name, yet perhaps without his consent, and she had dared what no Roman woman had dared before, to wage a civil war. Now the Republic had set the bill before her. Cast out of Rome, Fulvia came to rest in Sicyon, a Greek city that had become a sort of waiting room for those whose grasp at power had failed. She had gone to war not to enrich herself, but in her husband's name, believing she was defending Antony's interests, his honour, and perhaps the shared vision of Rome they had once held between them. But what met her in exile was not the welcome owed a hero. It was quiet. She had staked everything she had, her standing, her alliances, her very life. And still, Antony did not rush to her side. Indeed, by the time she reached Greece, Antony was already caught up with Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether the romance had truly begun, or was only just gathering, the meaning of it was crushing all the same. While Fulvia had been raising legions, Antony had been raising his cup at banquets beside a queen. The wound went deep, and not in her heart alone, but in the matter of power. For she had fought a war to keep Antony's authority secure in Italy, and in return he simply left her to twist in the wind. Some of the ancient historians, Plutarch chief among them, suggest that Antony was angry with her for setting the Perisine War in motion without his explicit blessing. Others hold that he welcomed her ruin, since it opened the door to a marriage alliance with Octavian, the very thing Fulvia would never have allowed. Even so, she was not wholly abandoned. A number of Antony's soldiers, fiercely devoted to her, pressed for a reconciliation. But her health had begun to give way, and after surviving siege and exile and betrayal, Fulvia died at Sicyon in the year 40 before the Common Era, perhaps from sickness, perhaps from strain, perhaps from a broken heart, or perhaps from all of these together. She was somewhere near 43 years of age. Her death handed Antony a tidy way out. He met with Octavian not long after, and agreed to wed Octavian's sister Octavia as part of a freshly mended peace. The members of the triumvirate were, for a time, brought back together, but only because Fulvia, the single woman bold enough to thwart their plans, was no longer there. Her name would soon be eclipsed by Cleopatra, whose legend would overshadow nearly every Roman woman of the time. But there should be no mistaking it. Fulvia was the original mould. She did not handle power from behind a curtain. She walked straight into it, planted herself at its very centre, and dared to command armies in a world that treated women as little more than furniture. Rome had no idea what to make of her, and so it set about erasing her. Yet the embers of her rebellion would go on smouldering, and her story was anything but ordinary. After Fulvia died in the year 40 before the Common Era, the very men she had once steered and managed, Antony, Octavian, and even those who had once been her allies, set quietly to the task of rewriting what she had been. She could no longer speak for herself, and so the story of her was moulded by her enemies and by the uneasy survivors of her ambition. As has happened to so many powerful women across the centuries, Fulvia was turned into a scapegoat. The ancient sources, set down for the most part by men with their own stakes in the matter, painted her as the cause of the Pyrrhusine War, of the breach between Antony and Octavian, and even of the general unrest of the Republic. Appian, Cassius Dio, and Plutarch all cast her as overbearing, jealous, and consumed by a craving for power. They laid it at her feet that Lucius Antonius had been drawn into conflict, that Octavian had been antagonized, even that Antony had at last grown estranged from Rome. But was there any fairness in such charges? Hardly. Fulvia had worked within a political world where violence and manipulation were simply expected, at least of a man. She was no more ambitious than Caesar had been, no more aggressive than Pompey, and far less ruthless than Octavian himself would in the end prove to be. Her single true departure from the ordinary was that she was a woman behaving as a Roman man behaved, and Rome had no way to stomach the sight. She was not shut up in the household, weaving in silence, or serving as some decorative token. She was writing to generals, marshalling the mobs of the streets, and drawing loyalty from the troops. And that made her dangerous, not to Octavian alone, but to the memory of history itself. Even Mark Antony, the very man whose legacy she had struggled to keep whole, found it convenient to blame Fulvia for the strife. Once he had reconciled with Octavian and married his sister, Antony used her death as a kind of political washing clean. Her memory became the cost of his own survival. No monuments rose in her honour. There was no grand funeral, no mourning speeches delivered in the Senate, only silence. And yet her enemies could not fully blot her out, for Fulvia had simply done too much. She had raised armies, guided elections, brokered alliances, and fought a civil war. She was the first Roman woman whose name was set upon coinage, not as a goddess or a figure of speech, but as a political force in her own right. The harm done to her reputation was deliberate, and yet so too was the mark she left upon the historical record. For all the efforts to bury her beneath caricature and slander, Fulvia would not be made to disappear. Her defiance echoes still. You just have to listen past the men who told it. Fulvia's story closes in silence, yet what she left behind has never been quiet. For centuries after her death, the writers and chroniclers of Rome struggled to find a place for her in the city's great story, because Fulvia had broken nearly every rule about what a Roman woman was permitted to be. She did not merely murmur counsel into the ears of powerful men from somewhere off stage. She stepped forward and took hold of power herself, and that was precisely what made her impossible to forget, and impossible for a patriarchal world to forgive. In a society that expected women to nudge events along through quiet marriages and softer suggestions, Fulvia made herself heard through policy, through warfare, through open political theatre. She was not a companion to a leader. She was a leader. And still, she was remembered far more for her boldness than for anything she actually built. The historians of Rome could not bear the picture of a woman who refused to keep to her assigned corner, so they painted her as shrill, grasping, and chaotic. Read carefully, though, and a very different woman comes into view. Fulvia was the first Roman woman to have coins struck bearing her name. She assembled political factions, she used marriage as a deliberate strategic instrument, and she worked the street politics of Rome with remarkable skill. Through the civil wars of the first century before the Common Era, she moved not as an onlooker, but as a participant. A woman whose reach unsettled senators and helped steer the fortunes of the triumvirs. Her fall came not from any failure of ability. It came from the accident of when she lived and the fact that she was a woman. Born male, she might well have been remembered as a second Caesar or as a more charismatic Cato. Instead, she was filed away as the dangerous woman who reached for too much. And yet her influence quietly endured. The Roman women who followed her, figures such as Livia Drusilla and Agrippina the Younger, and even Cleopatra, though she belonged to a different world, would all operate within the space that Fulvia had begun to clear. They would shape emperors, command armies, and decide questions of succession. But Fulvia did all of this first, and she did it without any imperial title to protect her. In our own time, historians have begun to look at her again with clearer eyes. She is no longer treated as a simple warning, but recognized instead as one of the most politically engaged women that Rome ever produced. A person who pressed against the limits of what female power was allowed to be and paid dearly for the pressing. She did not just happen to live during the age of the triumvirs. She contested it. And though Rome did its best to scrub her from the record, her fingerprints can be found in every corner of its long unravelling. Not a footnote at all, but a force. A woman who arrived several centuries before her time. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a nation balanced uneasily between two worlds, one still anchored in systems of oppression that stretched back centuries, and another straining to draw a freer breath. Across the Deep South, segregation was not simply a custom that people fell into, it was written into the law itself. Black Americans were shut out of restaurants and schools, kept off buses and away from voting booths, denied even the use of the same drinking fountains. Violence by police was common. Lynching still happened. In cities such as Birmingham, Alabama, demonstrators who marched in peace found themselves facing snarling dogs and the brutal force of fire hoses. But change was on its way, and it had stopped asking for permission. Within just a handful of years, the civil rights movement had pushed its way into the center of national attention. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts had become the regular language of the headlines. Names like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis had grown into more than names. They had become emblems of refusal. The March on Washington did not spring from any single meeting or conversation. It grew out of mounting frustration tangled together with a stubborn, burning hope. Black Americans were finished with the idea of waiting patiently. They were demanding their civil rights, and they meant to be heard in the one place where it would carry the most weight, the capital of the nation itself. The notion of a great march in Washington was not new. It had drifted through the movement for decades. A. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer and lifelong advocate for civil rights, had first put the idea forward back in the 1940s. In those years, its purpose had been to pressure the Roosevelt administration into desegregating the defense industry, and the protest was finally called off only after Roosevelt relented and signed an executive order. Now, in 1963, the stakes had climbed higher still. Randolph, together with other civil rights leaders including Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., breathed life back into the old vision. This time, they were not marching only for jobs. They were marching for dignity, for the right to vote, for the desegregation of schools, for equal pay, and above all, for the plain human right to live without fear. More than a dozen of the major civil rights organizations set their many disagreements aside and came together to plan it, because they understood how much strength lay in a single, unified front. The countdown had started. Buses were being arranged. Flyers were going out. Word of mouth was traveling faster than any newspaper could. and all across the country, Black Americans were readying themselves for what would become one of the most unforgettable days in the nation's history. The dream was taking its shape one footstep at a time. Mounting any protest in Washington was a considerable undertaking on its own, but planning one for more than 100,000 people, perhaps far more, bordered on the impossible. The logistics alone read like an endless list. Food, water, transportation, sound systems, restrooms, medical teams, permits, crowd control, and plans for keeping everyone safe. And somehow, against all of it, they made it work. At the heart of this carefully managed chaos stood Bayard Rustin, a man who, despite being openly gay and often pushed into the background for political reasons, was a strategist of rare brilliance. Rustin had studied non-violence directly with the followers of Mahatma Gandhi in India. He had marched, been jailed, beaten, and watched closely by the FBI, and none of it had shaken him. He saw the March on Washington as a chance to show the world what disciplined, non-violent protest could accomplish when it was coordinated with something close to military precision. In a span of only 8 weeks, Rustin and his team turned the idea into something real. The event was formally named the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and that title was chosen with care to hold together both racial justice and economic opportunity. The double message was deliberate. Dr. Kopp. King would later become the spiritual face of the day, but it was Randolph and Rustin who made certain that the demands spoke just as loudly about unemployment, minimum wage, and the rights of workers as they did about civil rights. Beneath all of this, tension quietly simmered. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were anxious, deeply anxious. They feared riots, a backlash, or worse still, bloodshed. The civil rights leaders gave their assurances that the protest would remain peaceful. Even so, the National Guard was held on standby. Hospitals across the city were placed on alert. The sale of liquor was halted for the day, and federal employees were told they could simply stay home. Then there was the matter of unity itself. The Big Six civil rights organizations, the NAACP, COR, CNCC, the SCLC, the National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, often disagreed sharply over tactics. Some pressed for more radical action, others for more careful diplomacy. The young firebrands of SNCC were growing restless with King's non-violent approach, but on one point they all stood together. The time for silence was over. Rustin's plan unfolded like a military operation. Every bus and every train was tracked. Every speaker was timed down to the minute. Every route had marshals trained in managing the crowds. They were not simply planning a march. They were arranging a moment meant to stir the conscience of an entire country. The 28th of August 1963, a sweltering Wednesday in Washington. The sun was already fierce by 9 in the morning, and the humidity clung to the skin like a second layer of clothing. None of it turned them away. From every part of the country they arrived, black and white, young and old, students, clergy, factory workers, and celebrities. Some came dressed in their Sunday best, others carried protest signs. They travelled by bus, by train, by carpool, and some on foot. More than 250,000 people in all gathered on the National Mall like a rising tide of hope. And still, there was no chaos. For all the government's dread of riots and disorder, the scene was astonishingly calm. Volunteers guided the flow of foot traffic. The Red Cross passed out water. People sang freedom songs, joined hands, and cheered as fresh waves of marchers came in. Near the reflecting pool you could hear gospel choirs, and the cry of jobs and freedom rang off the marble columns of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities were among them too: Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, but no one had come for autographs. They had come to witness history and to add their voices to a cause larger than any single person. The crowd was orderly and yet alive with energy. There was no shoving, no looting, no violence. In its place was a shared sense that this was not merely a protest, but something close to sacred. For many Black Americans, simply standing on the Mall felt like a quiet act of revolution, to be seen, to be counted, to declare that we are here, in front of the very Lincoln Memorial, where the great emancipator sits carved in stone. It was a moment that closed a long circle, generations in the making. At noon precisely, the official program opened. The leaders came to the stage one after another, each speaking for a different organization, a different set of ideas, a different region, yet bound together by a common message. They called for equal pay, for desegregated schools, for a living wage, and for an end to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang. Marian Anderson, who had once been forbidden to sing at Constitution Hall because of her race, now lifted her voice for thousands beneath the open sky. As the hours wore on, the tension grew, not from any unrest, but from sheer anticipation. The man everyone had been waiting for had not yet spoken, and when at last he did, the world would pause, listen, and remember. The march was not only making history, minute by minute, it was turning into legend. By the middle of the afternoon, the crowd had fallen quiet, not from weariness, but because they sensed what was coming. Stepped toward the podium. He wore a dark suit and a neatly knotted tie, and his face held a deep calm that only just contained the fire gathering within him. He carried remarks that had been prepared, typed out and written together with his advisers the night before. But what the world would hold on to was not what had been typed. It was what rose up out of his heart. He opened with a measured intensity, laying out the harsh realities of segregation, of police violence, of promises left broken. 100 years later, he said, pointing back to the Emancipation Proclamation, "The Negro still is not free." His voice climbed and fell like a sermon. He used repetition, rhythm, and silence, not as filler, but as instruments. The crowd listened in rapt attention, some nodding, some quietly wiping away tears, others holding signs that read simply, "Now." Standing just behind King was the gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier in the program. All at once she called out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And King did. He set his notes aside, took hold of the podium, and gave himself over to a passage he had delivered before, though never quite like this. "I have a dream," he said, and the crowd leaned toward him. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, and live out the true meaning of its creed. Each line came louder, clearer, more certain than the last. I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It was no longer a speech. It had become a vision, a prayer, a bolt of lightning passing through history. By the time King closed with the words, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the crowd broke open, applause, tears, shouts of pure joy. They understood that they had heard something more than oratory. They had heard prophecy. The power of the March on Washington lay not only in the speeches or the music, it lay in the people themselves. The simple, overwhelming scale of humanity gathered there that day was almost beyond grasping. They came from Mississippi and Michigan, from Alabama and New York, from California, and every quiet corner in between. A few were practiced organizers who had walked in a dozen marches already. Others had scarcely set foot beyond the edges of their own hometowns before this day. They wrapped sandwiches to carry along, they rode buses for 20 hours and more, and they slept upright in their Sunday clothes simply so they could be present. So many among them were everyday folk, housemaids and school teachers, men who worked the steel, clerks who sorted the mail, and they thought of themselves not as figures of politics, but as people who had come to bear witness. Change was not only what they hoped for, they themselves were the change. There were children there too, scattered through the gathering. Little black girls with ribbons tied in their hair. Boys carrying signs they had lettered by hand. Parents lifted small ones up onto their shoulders so the children might glimpse the Lincoln Memorial far off and catch the speakers' voices drifting over the loudspeakers. For them this was no mere occasion. It felt like the opening of a whole new world. Certain faces stayed in the memory. There was John Lewis, young still, only 23, standing for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known by its initials as SNCC. The speech he had first written was so blazing, so unwilling to soften, that the older leaders quietly asked him to ease its edges in the final minutes before he stepped to the microphone. He gave way, though only a little, and even tempered, his words shook the crowd with their call for sweeping change. And there was Daisy Bates, the single woman to speak from that platform, not for herself but reading aloud, a statement prepared on behalf of the women of the movement. The organizers had drawn criticism for pushing female voices to the margins, and Bates's short, weighty message laid bare an uncomfortable truth, that even inside a cause built on equality, some voices had to fight simply to be heard. Among the throng were labor organizers, rabbis and nuns, priests and students drawn from every kind of background. They did not see eye to eye on the way forward. Some held to King's path of nonviolence. Others felt the pull of Malcolm X and his harder, more militant stance. Yet, on that single day, none of that division seemed to matter. Unity carried the hour. It was a kind of visible music of what America might become, white hands and black hands clasped together, Freedom Now buttons fastened to lapels, and the sound of 250,000 people drawing breath as if they shared one set of lungs. The faces in that crowd were not merely looking on as history happened. They were the ones bending it into shape, and not one of them would ever let go of what they had seen. But while the watching world took in the unity, the inspiration, the quiet poetry of justice on the memorial steps, the truth backstage was far less tidy. What appeared to be one smoothly running movement was in fact lashed together with string and sweat and no small amount of compromise made at the last possible moment. Bayard Rustin, the man who designed the march, had to wrestle not only with logistics but with politics. He lived under constant scrutiny, partly because he was openly gay and had once belonged to the Communist Party, and partly because some leaders feared his identity would be turned into a weapon against the cause. There had even been a moment when Congressman Adam Clayton Powell threatened to declare publicly that Rustin and Dr. King were lovers, unless King dropped Rustin from an earlier effort. That threat shadowed every stage of the planning. Then came the matter of women's voices once more. For all the essential work of women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, not one of them was asked to give a major speech in her own name. Rosa Parks stood in the crowd that day, honored by everyone present, yet the microphone was never handed to her. Beneath the stirring images lay this quieter reality, that the movement was still working out its own hierarchies and its own blind spots. Even among the so-called Big Six organizations there was friction simmering. The leaders of SNCC had grown weary of how slowly things moved and of the older generation's insistence on moderation. They wished to strike at systemic racism far more directly. CORE shared much the same frustration, but for that one day unity was judged too precious to risk. All the while the federal government looked on with its teeth clenched. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had sent more than 100 agents to watch the organizers. They listened in on hotel rooms, trailed the leading figures, and gathered files. They had convinced themselves the march would erupt into violence, or that communists would seize control of it. When neither thing came to pass, they merely intensified their watching, with Dr. King most of all in their sights. And there was the simple problem of money. The march cost something past $250,000, a sum worth millions now, most of it gathered through the unions and through sympathetic givers, yet the organizers were still scrambling right up to the final hour. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. The March on Washington was historic, certainly, but it was also deeply human, imperfect and untidy, political and unfinished, much like the very country it was trying to mend. The sun began to slit down behind the Washington Monument as the great gathering drifted slowly apart. People embraced and wept and sang, and they lingered as long as they could manage, unwilling to leave ground that had come to feel sacred. But the march had ended. The speeches were spoken. The signs had been lifted high. The world had watched. And now a question hung in the thick August air. What comes after this? In the days that followed straight away, the press responded with a careful sort of approval. The major papers acknowledged that something historic had occurred, though often in a tone of distant curiosity. Some called it orderly and dignified, which was really their way of saying that no one had rioted. Few of them gave much room to the actual demands of the march, the call for a federal jobs program, or a doubled minimum wage that would equal something near $20 in today's money. But every outlet covered Dr. King's speech. That much, at least, could not be set aside. President John F. Kennedy, who had been against the march before it happened, watched it unfold on television with a growing admiration and perhaps a measure of surprise. He called the day impressive and met with the civil rights leaders at the White House right afterward, yet the wheels of legislation kept turning slowly. His proposed civil rights bill was still stuck in Congress, snared in the grip of Southern opposition. Some activists felt let down. They had hoped the march would bring action at once. Instead came a return to the long labor of it, the organizing, the marching, the resisting, and the grieving for those who had paid the cost of justice. Only a few weeks later that hard reality struck. On the 15th of September 1963, 4 black girls were killed when the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham was bombed. The dream had been spoken aloud, yes, but the nightmare had not loosened its hold. And yet something had shifted. The March on Washington opened a new chapter in the movement. It showed that a mass protest could be disciplined and powerful and impossible to overlook. It had drawn together a coalition wider than any before it: the labor unions, the faith leaders, the celebrities, the students, and the working people, all gathered in one place by a shared sense of justice. And above all else, it gave the movement a voice, a dream, a speech that would be quoted and studied and repeated all around the world. The march was finished, but the road was only beginning, and that road would soon pass through bloodshed, through legislation, and through transformation. The march did more than trouble the conscience of the country. It reworked its moral terrain. What had started as a daring act of protest grew into one of the foundations of the movement's legacy, changing for good how Americans understood justice and democracy, and the strength that lies in acting together. In the realm of law, it brought no instant triumph, but it built momentum. In less than a year, in July of 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which struck down segregation in public places and forbade discrimination in employment on grounds of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The following year, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act came after it, cutting straight at the heart of the Jim Crow laws. Would those laws have passed without the march? Perhaps they would have. But would they have carried the same moral weight, the same plain and undeniable public pressure? Most likely not. For Martin Luther King Jr., the speech he gave that day lifted him into another place altogether. He passed from a respected leader into a figure known the world over. Yet that renown carried its own price: the surveillance, the threats, and at the last his assassination in 1968. The dream he described upon those steps would only grow more affecting, more sorrowful, and more honoured with each year that went by. For the movement at large, the march revealed what unity was capable of achieving. It handed organisers a pattern for mobilising people on a vast scale, and it stirred a whole generation of activists at home and far beyond. Those fighting apartheid in South Africa, students protesting across Europe, and human rights leaders yet to come in every part of the world would point back to the March on Washington as their model. And the legacy is not a thing locked away in the past. The language of the march, the joining of jobs and freedom, the picture of peaceful resistance, the lingering echo of "I have a dream," still moves through the protests of our own time. From the Million Man March to the Black Lives Matter gatherings, the sound of 1963 returns in every chant and every hand-lettered sign raised in Washington. King's Memorial stands now just across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial, and those who pass walk beneath his great likeness cut into stone, with words from that August day carved into the granite. But the true memorial was never the stone. It lives in classrooms and voting booths, in marches and in voices that refuse to fall quiet, because the dream was never meant to settle into the pages of history. It was meant to be lived, and the legacy of that one summer afternoon still asks us to live it. More than 60 years have gone by since that afternoon, when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been set down in textbooks, in documentaries, in the glass cases of museums. Dr. Fifting. King's speech is taught to school children. His voice, steady and full, returns in the nation's memory like a refrain held sacred. Yet for a great many people the question lingers still, whether the dream has truly been realized or only postponed. In certain ways, the progress is beyond argument. The legal machinery of segregation was taken apart. Voting rights, though now under fresh pressure in many states, were secured through blood and marches and battles in the courts. The sight of black lawmakers and judges, of mayors, and of a president elected to 2 terms would have seemed impossible in 1963. Marriage across racial lines, once outlawed across much of the country, is protected now by federal law. These are not small matters. They are victories cut out of relentless struggle, and yet the original demands of the march, the ones so often overshadowed by the speech, still go unanswered. The call for a living wage remains unmet. The gaps in education and housing, in employment and in health, are dug in deep along lines of race. Police violence, the very thing that lit much of the earliest organizing, still sets off fresh outrage and fresh protest. The dream of real economic justice, of a country where what a person can become is not decided in advance by their zip code or the color of their skin, sits a long way still from reality. Movements of the present day, Black Lives Matter among them, have picked up the burden, often drawing on the images and the words of the 1963 march as both inspiration and accusation at once. They walk through the same cities, they chant along the same streets, and they ask for the same plain human rights. But they do it in a world remade by social media, by surveillance, by new ways of resisting. The March on Washington was never meant to be the ending of anything. So the dream endures, battered and questioned and reinterpreted, but living still, and whether it is deferred or distorted or one day fully kept depends not on the past at all, but on us, on the choices we make, on the wrongs we are willing to face, and on the courage we can gather to march again. It was a turning point, a stake driven into the ground that said, "This is who we are, and this is what we demand." It was a declaration, not a settling of accounts. And again, until the dream becomes something shared and truly lived. And so we come to the close of our long night together. The voices have quieted now, the crowds have long since gone home, and the great memorial stands once more in its silence under the moving sky. We have wandered through one summer afternoon, and the years that flowed out from it, through the ordinary people and the famous names, through the tangled work behind the scenes and the long road that stretched out ahead. There is no need to hold on to any of it now. The history will keep, just as it always has, waiting patiently for whenever you wish to return to it. For now, let the day settle behind you like the sun behind that distant monument, slow and quiet and unhurried. Rest easy, wherever you are. And whenever you find your way back, there will be another quiet story waiting here in the dark, told gently, in no rush at all, only for the sake of a peaceful night.